Hello, everyone. My name is Bethan Bide, and I am a lecturer in design and cultural theory at the University of Leeds. But I'm also a fashion historian, and I'm really interested in how fashion connects the design, the social, and the cultural histories of Britain, and how it can help us to understand a bit about how our local history connects us to bigger national and global histories. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. I want to talk a little bit about cotton and its relationship to British fashion. And I want to tell this story using some objects from the collections of Leeds museums and galleries in order to show how cotton connects us in Yorkshire to the rest of the world. And I'm doing this with the assistance of some of the wonderful curators at Leeds Museums and Galleries. So in particular, I'd like to thank Natalie Raw and Vanessa Jones, who are fashion curators there, for all their help with this research. So cotton and British fashion have a long intertwined history. When people think about kind of iconic British fashions, they're often made of cotton. So I'm thinking everything from the kind of Regency flowing muslin dresses that people see in Jane Austen adaptations to depictions of the British royal family. So you can see here the royal princesses Elizabeth and Margaret on a royal tour in 1947, both wearing cotton outfits. But the use of cotton fashion is really interesting because it helps us kind of question, where are the boundaries of British fashion? How does fashion interact with our global understanding of who we are? How have our British cotton fashions been enabled by our relationship with the world? And this is a story that helps us understand a little bit about British Empire, about how the borders of what Britain is have grown and shrunk, and also about the shared experiences we have in Britain to other places in the world. And I would really like to tell this story by looking beyond just thinking about the raw material of cotton, but also thinking about how design influences have come to us in Britain from the rest of the world. So really think about how we as consumers in Yorkshire actually are one step in a really long history of cotton connecting us through what we wear to lots of other places. And I'd like to do that as a way of asking us to reflect a little bit about what clothes mean to us today. So asking us to think about where our clothes come from and perhaps how we might be able to consume them a bit more responsibly. But before we get on to all of that, I think we should start with a brief history about the use and the production of cotton. So cotton was first imported to Britain in the 16th century, where it was composed of a mixture of sort of linen or yarn. But by 1750, cotton cloths were being produced, and the imports of raw cotton from areas such as the West Indies continued to grow and really fuel cotton production in Britain. And this was a trade that was enabled by Britain's empire. So those imperial trade links allowed cotton as a fabric to have a really important impact on culture and clothing and style here in Britain. And it was during this surge in popularity in the 18th century that the East India Company increased its imports of calico, which is cheap cotton fabric, from India in order to meet the kind of growing demands from the poorest people in Britain. And this really launched cotton onto the British mass market. In fact, in such a significant way that it had a really negative impact on British textile manufacturers, so that in 1721, the government passed an act called the Calico Act, which banned the use of calicos in clothing for domestic use in order to make sure that people in Britain who were making textiles could still sell their goods. But this ban couldn't really hold back the tide, because cotton, especially in a kind of cheap calico form, was such a useful fabric that the ban only lasted a couple of decades. And following this, the Industrial Revolution sparked just a wave after wave of engineering phenomenons, new inventions that allowed Britain to produce its own cotton textiles. And technology is a really important part of this story. Technology really matters the changing state of cotton production. So cotton evolves very quickly during the 18th and 19th centuries. We've got a lovely plate here from William Hogarth's series, Industry and Idleness, and the collections at Leeds Museums and Galleries have an edition of this. And it shows some apprentices working at their looms. And these looms kind of show the evolution of technology in the 18th century that allowed cotton to be made in much larger quantities and much faster. So in 1733, a man called John Kay invented the flying shuttle, which allowed wider amounts of cloths to be weaved at a much faster speed. Then the spinning jenny, which was invented by James Hargreaves, and the water frame, which was created by Richard Arkwright, enabled really large-scale cotton production to happen in Britain. And these engineering feats of the day were revolutionary. They transformed British textile manufacturing to a point where by the late 1700s, cotton products accounted for about 16% of British exports. And by the early 1800s, so just a couple of years later, this multiplied to about 42% of British exports. So by the early 1800s, Britain's really dominating the world cotton market. And one of the key reasons for this is that the British Empire gave Britain access to really significant global trading networks and raw materials, because the cotton that was being woven in Britain wasn't being grown in Britain. We don't have the right kind of climate in Britain to grow cotton. It is too cold, it's too wet at the wrong times. So who did farm all of the cotton that was being made into British cloth and British fashions? Alongside the cotton that's being transported across the Atlantic, Africans were transported along the same trade routes, these transatlantic slave routes. And lots of these Africans were sold as slaves to work in America, where it was, in the American South, very good conditions for growing cotton. During the same period, America also owned many of the Caribbean islands, and as a result, Africans are also enslaved on the Caribbean, as well as being enslaved in America, and obviously also in the British colonies in the Caribbean as well. So the cotton that's being woven in Britain is being produced by enslaved people in places like Georgia in the United States of America, or on Caribbean plantations. And these people were a really important part of the cotton trade story. Although obviously very few of their stories really exist. So it's hard sometimes for us to find ways of kind of foregrounding their stories and their experiences. But this is something that my colleagues at Leeds Museums and Galleries have really been working on, kind of foregrounding in their dress and textile collections. So for example, you can see this in a piece that they've identified as telling this story. So this is a piece from the Leeds Museums and Galleries collections. And it dates from about 1783 to 1789. And it's a piece of cotton textile that's been printed using copper plate, and it's called America Pays Homage to France. And it is attributed to a French textile designer, Jean-Baptiste Huet, and it was printed by a company called Jouet in France, who are very famous cotton textile producers at this time. And it's a textile that celebrates the friendship between France and America, marking American independence from the British colonies. And it's really interesting because if you look a little bit closely, you can see there's a figure crouching behind the figure that represents America, so holding that American flag with the stars and stripes. And this figure is kneeling, wearing just trousers, so not wearing a top, and sort of positioned kind of behind a palm tree. And this figure represents an enslaved African. And I think it's really interesting that this very fashionable cotton piece really, height of fashion, these types of textiles at the time, which depicts this enslaved person, was also very likely produced using slave labor. And it's actually quite a rare visual reminder for the people who were consuming fabrics like this in Europe, that the stuff that they were buying was connected to the Atlantic slave trade and perhaps the more unpalatable realities of that. It was quite easy most of the time for you to sort of ignore that that's where the cotton you were buying was coming from. But although lots of British consumers didn't really consider the origins of the cotton they wore, as the anti-slavery movement grew in the 19th century, there was an increasing awareness. So this is a black and white photograph dating from about 1858, and it shows the Clark family, so the family behind Clark shoes. And you can see that they are all wearing these slightly strange, unusual bits of clothing. And that's because what they're wearing are free labor cotton clothing. So during the 1840s and 1850s, lots of anti-slavery activists turned to direct consumer action to attack slavery. So in the 1820s, there were sugar boycotts. And following on from this, people started to think about other products they consumed and where they came from. And obviously, cotton was one of those. So this movement was led by Quakers who looked for kind of a range of alternatives to slave-grown products. So this movement was called the Free Produce Movement. And it helped people to find cotton that was grown not by enslaved people. And this is something that the historian Anna Vaughan Kent has explored in her research. And it's a really interesting story about how the sort of British women's Quaker movement led a boycott of cotton during those middle decades of the 19th century. And in fact, one of the women pictured here, Eleanor Stevens Clark, who was the Quaker wife of the pioneer behind Clark shoes, ran her own free labor cotton depot, which was a small shop where from about 1853 until 1858, she provided her community with free cotton for their use. And we think that this kind of slightly unusual fabric was probably made by a man called John Wingrove, who was a Carlisle philanthropist and hand loom weaver. But it wasn't just the places where cotton was grown and processed that exploited people for profit. That also happened closer to home in the weaving process. because much of the cotton that was woven in England used indentured labour, which is where a person was contracted to work without a salary for a certain number of years. And this practice occurred at Quarrybank Mill, which is an existing mill near Manchester, now operated by the National Trust. And at Quarrybank Mill, young children were often contracted from workhouses as apprentices at the mill. So you can imagine if you are a young child at a workhouse, you don't really have very much control over this, you don't have very much say over this, and you don't have very many options either. And this could be a very difficult and hard life. So you learnt skills, but it was also a dangerous occupation, and it was often a very unpleasant occupation. And these images here are taken from the apprentice house at Quarrybank Mill. And they really show how I think the National Trust are trying to tell the stories of these children. Again, much like enslaved people, the stories of these children aren't really recorded that much in the historical record. So it's hard to know that many details about their lives, and who they were and where they came from. But I think acknowledging the really significant role they played in driving Britain's Industrial Revolution, in creating wealth for the nation, is a really important part of how cotton has shaped who we are, where we've come from. And the importance of Britain's sort of empire and its global trade networks weren't just important for the production of cotton, they were also really important for fashion design and for Britain developing its own distinctive looks and fashion cultures. A really good example of this is one that I highlighted slightly at the beginning of this talk when I talked about those kind of Jane Austen adaptations. And that look that I'm talking about is the fashion for muslin. So that very lightweight cotton. So by the end of the 18th century, the really rigidly tailored garments for men and women were being replaced by styles that were a little bit easier to wear, a little bit more comfortable. And this resulted in the neoclassical style of the 1780s. And this was kind of inspired by the statuary of ancient Greece and Rome, but it was enabled by the importing of this very lightweight cotton, because this lightweight cotton, which fell around the body in a very unstructured way, and which would be sort of held high around the waist, often with quite a simple sash, perhaps accompanied by a sort of soft shawl. This style was really enabled by the type of fabric that was being used, so that very soft, very lightweight muslin. And it was a style that also lent itself to other fashionable imported goods that were coming from India, like that muslin fabric. So things like Kashmiri shawls. And you can see in this dress here, which is actually from the Victoria and Albert Museum's collections, that the fineness of that Bengali muslin that's being used here is almost kind of see-through. It's got this very, very fine property that just wasn't being produced in the UK. So it's a nice example of how skills and technologies from places like Bangladesh enabled what we now consider to be very quintessentially British fashions to come into being. But the craze for muslin wasn't the first time that Indian production skills influenced British fashion. So in the 18th century, Indian chintz became extremely fashionable across Europe. And chintz is a type of kind of printed cotton fabric, hand-painted, hand-dyed cotton fabric. And it's really interesting because what we see here is a really great early example of kind of cross-cultural exchange and design dialogue. So you can see here, it's another example from the Victoria and Albert Museum. This is an overdress, which is made of this hand-painted and dyed cotton. in these kind of wonderful shades of red and blues and greens. And it's obviously a very Western European style of fashion, but the design of the flora and the fauna is quite Indian. And the historian Aditi Kher has done some really interesting work tracing how the importing of this kind of patterned fabric changed our awareness of Indian flora and fauna in the UK. So you actually had a lot of people who became sort of experts in the types of flowers and vegetation and birds that you got in India who would never ever get the opportunity to visit India. But you also had a cultural exchange where Indian designers were modifying their designs to make them more popular to a British audience. So you see this kind of, I said, cross-cultural dialogue that really starts to come out here. And this is really interesting for us because it's a reminder that what we deem to be British fashions and what we deem to perhaps be fashions from elsewhere, there's a much finer line than we might consider, that actually a lot of our tastes are shaped by the stuff that we consume that comes from elsewhere, but also our tastes go on to shape other places. So fashion really does globally connect us. It's also interesting to think about chintz because chintz was a fabric that initially we imported from India, but after a while, British manufacturing technologies made it much cheaper to roller block print chintz type fabrics in Britain rather than having them hand painted, hand dyed in India. And that meant that British producers could make a kind of version of chintz much, much cheaper. And this actually had a really devastating impact on many Indian chintz producers. So actually a lot of the people who were making textiles in the Midlands and the north of England in the 19th century were directly causing harm to the businesses of Indian chintz producers. So again, thinking about how our kind of local manufacturing really has impacts on a global scale as well. The technology to print these types of cheap, colourful designs on cotton fabrics continued to develop in British cotton mills and would then go on to play a really significant role in Britain's rise as a major global fashion player in the 20th century. So up until the 1940s and 1950s, Britain had always really played second fiddle to places like Paris. It had been known for making good quality tailored wear, but it wasn't really known for kind of fun design, particularly not for women's wear. And cotton plays a really important story in how that changed. And a wonderful example of that is the company Horrockses. So Horrockses fashions were established in 1946 by an existing cotton manufacturers, Cruzen and Company Limited. So Horrockses, Cruzen and Company Limited were formed by John Horrockses in 1791. So you can see that they have been making cotton in Britain for a really long time. But by the 1940s, the company realized there was probably a need for them to diversify. So ready-to-wear manufacture had been growing steadily during the period between the two world wars, and Horrockses, Cruzen and Co. saw the opportunity for the business to grow. And this is also a really interesting story of thinking about where fashion is located in Britain. So I've sort of mentioned before that most of the kind of textile manufacture, cotton manufacture that happens in Britain is happening in the Midlands and the North. So particularly Lancashire, very important cotton manufacturers. And there's perhaps no surprise that Horrockses were based in Preston, Congleton and Manchester. That's where they made their goods. But when they became a fashion design company, not just making cotton sheets and cotton fabric, they opened a fashion house in Hanover Square in Mayfair in London, because they sort of recognized that in order to be taken seriously as a fashion manufacturer, you had to be based in London. And we see that quite a lot in terms of the history of British fashion. We see the kind of erasing of the important contributions that places like West Yorkshire made to British fashion, because London is seen as a more fashionable address. So a lot of businesses would use London as a kind of headline address. They would advertise themselves as being from London, even if actually they were really based elsewhere in England. So just to give you a sense of how successful Horrockses were, they were the people who dressed the 1947 royal tour. So that image of the royal princesses I showed you at the start of this talk. And they were really widely championed as a British export. And there's this lovely dress here on the left from the Leeds Museums and Galleries collection, which is a Horrockses, and this sort of lovely pink and grey floral print. And it was purchased at Marshall and Stelgroves in Leeds in February 1956. And it gives you a real sense of the kind of boldness of the colour, the kind of youthfulness of this sort of cut. And I suppose the sort of really encapsulates the kind of optimism of that post-war period. You're just emerging from the difficulties of the Second World War, and the colourful printed cottons that Horrockses are producing really encapsulate that optimism that young people wanted to take with them going forward. Something I do love when looking at Horrockses adverts is thinking about how they describe their cotton though. So you can see this Horrockses advert on the screen here, which says, "Such lovely cottons could only come from England." And they are talking about the fact that at this time, England has a really good reputation for printed textile design. But of course, as a sentence, actually, this doesn't make very much sense, because the raw cotton itself can't come from England. So what we're seeing here is a fashion company sort of erasing a large part of the story of where their clothes come from. They're talking about the printing of the cotton, the making of the cotton, but they're ignoring the whole production of cotton before that. So they're ignoring the growing of cotton. They're ignoring the kind of ginning, carding, combing processes that all happen before cotton is woven. And we see this quite a lot. We see the fact that when we think about how fashion's made, we don't do a very good job of thinking about the raw materials and all the work that goes in to producing them. Cotton is, as I said, a really important part of Britain's growing innovation in fashion in the 20th century. And British technology, just like it did in the Industrial Revolution, enables the British fashion industry to use cotton in new, innovative ways, making it more popular, easier to wear. And that includes even swimwear. So I know that we wouldn't necessarily think of cotton swimwear today, but obviously in an age before synthetic fabrics, when a lot of your alternative was wool, cotton was actually quite a useful fabric for making swimwear. And we've got a really lovely example here in this swimsuit, which is from the 1950s and is also in the collections of Leeds Museums and Galleries. It's sort of given its shape by the fact that it has these elasticated back panels to kind of hold the cotton in shape, because obviously cotton doesn't have very much stretch. So you can see it's a kind of innovation using elastic and cotton together in order to make something that will fit the body in a useful swimwear way. And we can see a sort of similar outfit being worn by this model who is modelling beachwear for the Yorkshire Post newspaper in 1959. So you can again really see that British cotton was enabling new types of youthful fashion trends to emerge in the 1950s, and that technology was a really important part of how that was happening. And this technology is really interesting for us to consider because Leeds and West Yorkshire was a real centre of a lot of that technological innovation that was transforming the way we could use textiles. And this was thanks to the science labs that were associated with the University of Leeds and the textile technology department, and also the labs that were attached to other West Yorkshire textile manufacturers, so people like the Marks and Spencer Textile Technology Labs. So the concentration of these textile firms and the university in this area really enabled it to become a specialist place for developing new textile technologies. And this allowed them to experiment with new types of synthetic fabrics, but it also enabled them to find ways to make cotton easier to wear and easier to care for. And there's a nice example of this in this dress, also from the Leeds Museums and Galleries collections, which dates from the early 1950s. And it's labelled Super Tremendo Non-Iron Cotton. Great name there. So boasting the fact that it's been treated in a way that means it won't hold creases after washing so much. So it's an example of that kind of technology combining with cotton to make new innovative fashions. And this dress was originally worn by the donor's mother, who lived in Bradley, which is near Skipton, in North Yorkshire. But it had a lovely second life in the late 1960s when it was given to the donor by her grandmother, who was then a student at Leeds College of Art, where she studied dress design and garment construction. So she says that this lovely dress was a kind of good inspiration for that. So as I've sort of discussed here, the boundaries of British cotton fashions have always extended beyond the British Isles, connecting us to places a very long way away. And that isn't just a story of raw cotton, it's a story of design. And I just wanted to finish with a kind of more modern example of that design story. And that is the story of the fabric designer Althea McNish, who is pictured here on the left. So Althea McNish was born in Trinidad and moved to London in 1951, where she trained in textile design at the Central School of Arts and Crafts and then at the Royal College of Art. After she graduated from the Royal College of Art, she was commissioned to design textiles for Liberty and Company, the famous department store in London, and to design textiles for a Dior fashion collection. In 1966, McNish designed fabrics for the Queen when she visited Trinidad, so really making a nice connection between her homeland and her adopted land. And I think that the designs for McNish's textiles really show the way that she drew on her Trinidadian background to create her designs. So you can see the kind of palm trees, the bright, vibrant colors. And they really show how the vibrancy of British fashion in the 60s that we've kind of talked about in that build-up, you know, the growing importance of people like Horrockses in the 50s, the new technologies that were enabling more comfortable, easy to use cottons combined with bright printed cottons really come together in the 60s. And McNish shows how actually the connections between the cotton manufacturers in the Midlands and in the north of England and connections between other places around the globe throughout the Commonwealth was so important to kind of creating that vibrancy for the fashion industry in Britain. And if you want to find out a little bit more about Althea McNish and her designs, there's actually an exhibition currently on display at the William Morris Gallery in Walthamstow, and it's soon to tour to the Whitworth in Manchester. But before we move on from McNish, I just wanted to dwell a little bit on the label at the edge of this fabric, which reads, "Woven and printed in England." And I think this is important because it shows that it's part of quite a kind of patriotic post-war buy British movement. So there was a real sense that in order to support the British economy, people should be buying British fashions. And I think that this is a really nice example of how the British fashion establishment embraced Althea McNish, so somebody who wasn't natively British, it was her adopted home. But as this talk demonstrates, these words also obscure the connections that the cotton fabric has to other places in the world. So by just saying that this fabric is woven and printed in England, we have no idea where the raw cotton came from. And we don't really think about how this bit of cotton fabric and the fashions that it produced are rooted in much broader global networks that are shaped by a history of international trade and shifting definitions of Britishness under empire. And I think that that's important because hopefully the way that we've talked about the connections between the cotton that people have made and worn and used in England today and other places in the world invites us to perhaps rethink the cotton clothes that we wear today and where they come from. And this is something that's close to my heart because a lot of the historical material we've talked about today forms part of a project that I'm working on called Cotton's Hidden Voices, which is funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council and is a working partnership between the University of Leeds, Leeds Museums and Galleries, and the Goa Institute of Management. And this project really aims to raise awareness about cotton production in India amongst British consumers. So showing British consumers all the work that goes into producing their clothes and helps them to explore the complex issues of sustainable and fashion consumption. And you can see some photographs here from some interviews and some videos we've been doing in India with cotton farmers, with people processing the raw cotton. So you can see them there picking out the seeds from the raw cotton. There's also an image there of the dye house, so that kind of very technologically advanced stage of the production process. And then some images of some people making that cotton fabric into t-shirts for a Western consumer. So hopefully that's sort of whetted your appetite for learning a bit more about this project, because we'll be talking more about this research at Leeds Museums and Galleries and also at Quarrybank Mill, that National Trust property, next year. So if you're interested, please keep your eyes peeled for some very exciting exhibitions and events. But in the meantime, I want to just close up by playing you a video that shows you how this project can perhaps help you think about how green your cotton t-shirt is, but also think about all the people who've been involved in producing that t-shirt for you, just like we've talked about today in terms of all of those historical connections, thinking about how the clothes that we wear today connect us to people from all over the world.